church a temple, a synagogue, or an onion? Peculiar title, isn't it? Well, we're going to get to the onion later on. But first, we're going to examine the history of the church. We can do this by delving back into Scripture, right back to the time of Moses, when Moses was called to bring the people, God's people, the Israelites, out of slavery, out of Egypt. He went down to Mount Sinai on the Sinai Peninsula. When he was there, God formed his people into a nation, and he did this by two different means. First, he gave his laws or his commandments to his people, his instructions on how they were to live their lives. We all have heard about the 10 Commandments, those 10 Commandments inscribed into stone with his finger. But there was in fact 613 commandments in total. So in conjunction with that, the Lord also formed the priesthood, and he called upon Aaron, the brother of Moses, to become the first high priest. So we're going to have a look at the significance of that time as the institution of the church. The first tabernacle was formed, the place where God himself would come and dwell amongst his people. From there, we're going to take a journey to the time of King Solomon, when he built the first temple of Jerusalem, a permanent structure for the same purposes, for God was going to come and dwell amongst his people in God's city, in this chosen place, Jerusalem. From there, we move forwards, and we have the destruction of the first temple of Jerusalem when the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar II took the people, the remaining people from the kingdom of Judah, into exile, and the temple was destroyed. Following that, King Cyrus the Great, he was there as a person who God used to return his people from exile, and they went back to the land, but now they were not free people. They were now underneath the rule of a foreign power. But they did have the permission from the king to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. So this was the second Temple of Jerusalem that was built. Before we get to the time of Jesus, when the Greek Empire came, they placed the Greek god Zeus Olympus, a massive statue, into the Temple of Jerusalem. This divided society. The majority of Jewish people would have nothing to do with this and would no longer go to the temple, whereas a minority who aligned themselves with the Greek authorities continued to go to the temple. This was the time where we learn about the formation of two different divided priests, and this was the time when we learn about the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This was also the time that the synagogue was formed, when basically people came together in their local communities to a place of gathering, and this is what the word synagogue means. And they did this because they no longer went to Jerusalem. So this is the formation of the synagogue, which is the second component of what I'm going to teach about in this particular lesson. When Jesus came, the synagogues were still a place where his people would teach and grow up their young. They would come together there. It was a place of community, a place where the Torah was read, where the children were taught, where the community came together to eat. So it was a gathering place. It was a place where all things happened. They weren't big. They were places that would usually hold 40 or 50 people in total. At this point in time, however, the Temple of Jerusalem was obviously still there, and no longer was the Greek statue in place of the god Zeus. But we did have the Pharisees running the temple at the time, and the conflicts that came as a result of that. After Jesus was crucified and went up to go with the Father in 70 AD, the Jews were already rebelling for 4 years, and the Romans under General Titus came in and they destroyed the temple. They set it on fire. They set the city of Jerusalem on fire. They destroyed it. And so the people fled. And at this point in time, the temple was no longer. And to this very day, the Temple Mount that's still there in Jerusalem has no temple on top. So there's things that have changed in terms of Judaism, which have no longer been able to take place, such as the sacrifice. So in today, when we fast forward from there, when Jesus went up to be with the Father, his disciples went out and they started to preach about Jesus. And this formed a new gospel, a new covenant period. And as a result of that, churches began to spring up everywhere, but churches were home churches. The first church was actually in Peter's home, and that was on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum. And these churches were again a gathering place, a place where people came together. They would eat together, they would teach together, they would pray together, and so forth. So we had the birth of the actual church itself, but there was a time of, of discomfort, because these Jewish people were challenged by the fact that should they still observe the laws that were given to them by their forefathers, or did this not matter anymore? Now Paul, the Apostle Paul, he went out to extraordinary distances and travelled far and wide to set up churches everywhere, but his ministry was to the Gentiles. So from the birth of that time comes the modern church that we know today. But there's some issues that lie within that, because we talk about the fivefold ministry, and it's very difficult to have a ministry that has all five attributes that come together under one roof. So for example, when Paul went out to the Gentiles, he was speaking to non-believers. So he would proclaim the word. So that means to preach as we know it today. But then people who had their own congregations, people who were believers, their point of view was to actually teach, because they already believed. They were no longer hearing the word of the Lord for the first time. So when we come together today in a modern church, we find ourselves with that situation where we talk about preachers, but there's also a need for teaching. And in a congregation, we'll have those who have already given their life to the Lord, who will seek to be taught to grow in insight and understanding and to disciple others. And yet at the same time, there'll be new people who will come into the body who will be hearing the word of the Lord for the first time. So the preacher will be proclaiming the word to them for the first time. So how do we do that? How do we bring that all together under one roof? Of course, with a fivefold ministry, there's other aspects to that as well. So this is actually quite a complex issue. And this is where we come to the onion, where we talk about the church with its different layers and people coming in from the outside, like the first outer ring of an onion, and we could call the senior pastor the inner ring of the onion. And what happens in between with all those different layers? How does it all work? So this is a really enjoyable lesson, and I'm going to kick off by going back to the time of Moses, and we're going to have a look at the tent of meeting, the original tabernacle. Well, let's start off by having a look at the forerunner to the temple. We're travelling back to the time of Moses, when he arrived at Mount Sinai, and the Lord came down upon the top of the mountain to meet with him. And from the ground, what the people there saw was the presence of the glory of the Lord, and obviously it was astonishing. It looked like fire that would consume all that it encountered. Moses entered into this cloud on top of the mountain and remained up there for 40 days and 40 nights. So over the period of 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave Moses instructions on receiving an offering from the Israelites for him. This offering was to be used to make a tabernacle and all the furnishings God required to use in it. This was to be a sanctuary for God, a place where he could come to dwell amongst his people. Now, to look this up for yourself in the Bible, if you go to the book of Exodus and you commence in chapter 25 and you read through chapter 25 through to chapter 30, this will encompass all of those requirements that the Lord gave to Moses. So they were to make an ark to hold the testimony or covenant that God was about to give to Moses. They were to make a table to put the bread of the presence, a lampstand with 7 lamps, the tabernacle itself, an altar and utensils for burnt offerings, a courtyard for the tabernacle, oil for the lampstand, garments for the priests, the altar of incense, a basin for washing, oil for anointment, and incense. So all these things were requested of Moses, and this request was to go out to the people to bring all of the goods forward in order to make this happen. Now God also told Moses at this point in time, have Aaron your brother brought to you from among the Israelites, along with his sons Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar, so they may serve me as priests. The last instruction given to Moses concerned the Sabbath, and it says in Exodus chapter 31 verses 16 to 17, the Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he abstained from work and rested. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the testimony, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. Now those tablets are what we know today as the 10 Commandments. They were inscribed on those tablets. Of course, as I said, however, Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights up there, and when we follow the story, he in fact goes back up again another time. So there are 613 commandments in total, but there was 10 that were inscribed on the stone by the finger of God. Now this was to be kept inside the Ark of the Covenant, which was to be kept inside the tabernacle itself. So this is the institution of the place where worship to God was to take place, and it was also to become the place where God would come and dwell amongst his people. So this is the first instance of the Bible since the time of Adam, when the Lord used to come and walk with him at dusk in the garden, when God once again visited with his people and he could be approached and communicated with by the high priest and the leader Moses. So this is an extraordinary first step. So this is the first instance of the formation of the priesthood, and you can call it the first instance of the formation of God's church, a place to go to where he resided, where people could come and worship him. Well, let's fast forward some 500 years, just a little bit over 520 years from the time when the tabernacle was first brought into place under the leadership of Moses. Now there's a picture beneath me there of the actual tabernacle, and you can see that it's a tent structure with an altar that's out the front and some of the other utensils, and they're basically surrounded by a fence made from poles and fabric. So this was a very portable tabernacle. It was designed to be packed and unpacked as the Israelites were called and moved throughout the desert through their 40 years of wandering. So as a structure in terms of its substance, it wasn't designed to be permanent, and so it wasn't so significant in terms of whether it was impressive. In fact, it was a tent of meeting, a place where Moses and the high priest Aaron would go in to meet with God. So when we fast forward to the time of King Solomon, some 520 years later, we come to a completely different scenario. Now there's a picture there beside me. This is an artist's illustration based on the biblical references that actually define the actual building itself, which we can find in the Bible. Now you can see that it's a very impressive structure. There's a very large altar out the front where you can see the priest up on top. There's the sea over there where you can see all of the bulls underneath for consecration, and then you can see the actual temple, the building itself, further behind. Of course, they're on the inner courtyard, and there's also another outer courtyard and some other layers. So to give you some insight and understanding into the temple that was built at Jerusalem, I'm just going to place a map, a plan view image on for you to have a look at, so you can actually absorb what the Bible says in writing, but you can see it visually, so you can get an idea of what this actual structure and what the layout was and what its purpose was by having a look at this picture. And then I'm going to take you on a journey, and I'm going to walk you through the time when the actual Ark of the Covenant was taken from the King David's palace up into the actual Holy of Holies, and what happened on that very special day when they consecrated and opened the temple to our Lord God. So let's bring to life the story, the journey at the time of the Ark of the Covenant that had been established right back in the time of Moses. And we find that it's finally going to be transported to the newly built Temple of Jerusalem, where King Solomon awaits inside the inner courtyard. So there's an air of great excitement and reverence. The people of Jerusalem had watched from their homes on the lower southern slopes of the city of David as the house of the Lord rose high above the ground from Araunah's old threshing floor over the last 7 years. So you may remember that the actual place of the actual temple was on the threshing floor, which was described right back in the time of Abraham as the same place where he took Isaac to be sacrificed. Now, these people, they'd seen thousands of men with teams of oxen. They'd hauling immense dressed blocks of white limestone from the surrounding hills, a size like they'd never seen before. Lengths of beautifully dressed timbers were also brought in by ox and cart from the coastal port of Joppa. These aromatic and lustrous cedar beams had first come from the king of Tyre as logs that they floated down the coast of the Great Sea, which is what we know as the Mediterranean Sea today. So they were floated down by Ras before they were sawn and then ornately chiselled. An abundant harvest had been reaped and joy abounded throughout the land. It was the 15th of Tishrei, and they had just completed fabricating their booths to live in for the next 8 days during the Feast of Tabernacles. Everyone was in high spirits. Together they had gone out into the streets to blow their shofars, their horns, to celebrate the Feast of Trumpets 15 days earlier. 5 days had now passed since they had atoned for their sins on the Day of Atonement, a solemn day which brought great relief. Today, however, they celebrated God's continuing provision to them in the current harvest, but also remembered his provision and protection given to their forefathers who wandered through the wilderness for 40 years after leaving Egypt. The men would normally appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose. This is from Deuteronomy 16, verse 16. To take their tithes and offerings proportionate to the blessing they received. But today was different. Rather than travelling to the priestly city chosen for them by God according to their tribe and location, they no longer did. Instead, they went up to Jerusalem for the house of the Lord, Beit ha-Mikdash, and the altar of God had been built. They lined the narrow winding streets through the city of David. It was common knowledge that the Ark of the Covenant was kept in a tent pitched by King David, but most of them had never seen it. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 3 to 4, it reads, "When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the Ark of the Lord in the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up. As the ark was carried past them, the splendour of it was overawing. A silence came upon the onlookers as it went past, and they humbly bowed in reverence." King Solomon stood inside the temple with the entire assembly around him in the inner court. When the priests and the Levites brought the Ark of the Covenant and the tent of meeting up to the temple, they passed first through the court of the Gentiles, the outermost area where all people, whether they were ritually clean or unclean, which means they could be Gentiles, non-Israelites, or Israelites. So it can be both in this particular area. Next, they passed through what's known as the Soreg, which was the fence that separated these people from the rest of the Temple Mount to enter what was known as the Beautiful Gate. You can read about the Beautiful Gate in the book of Acts in the New Testament, chapter 3, verses 2 and verses 10. So they entered the Beautiful Gate into the outer court. As the priests climbed the steps through the richly ornamented brass-clad gate, the gatekeepers and the guards bowed in reverence. It was so large and heavy that it took 20 men to open and close it. The outer court was also called the Court of the Women. They were permitted to be there, but they could go no further. As the priests and Levites walked through the Court of the Women, they passed by the chamber of the Nazarites and the chamber of oils and wines to their left, and the chamber of wood and chamber of lepers to their right. The chamber of Nazarites was used by those at the end of their Nazarite vows to cook their peace offerings and burn the hair they cut off after their vow period had ended. The chamber of oils and wine stored the staples used in the temple, whilst the chamber of wood could be entered to select appropriate wood for use on the hearth and the altar. The chamber of lepers was for those who had been healed of their disease and purified to wait until they were admitted to the inner court of the temple. Can you imagine what they would look like at church today? You can see there's an extraordinary difference in the picture that's been painted here, and this all comes from the scriptures. So continuing on. Also scattered throughout this court was 13 trumpet-shaped boxes used for the purpose of receiving monetary offerings. The Nicanor gate before them could be closed off by their gatekeepers, which was another magnificent entrance. This separated the outer court from the inner court. The priests and Levites passed through this gate, and just inside was the hall of priests and the hall of Israelites, where the Israelites will come to wait in reverent silence as the priests burn their sacrifices to God. The first hall was the hall of Israelites, both to the left and right, as they passed through the gates. After climbing 3 steps called the Dukan, they then passed the hall of priests, which was also to their left and to their right. The Dukan will become the place where the priests will bless the people as they come in and bring their sacrifices. Climbing the steps of this Dukan, the priests and Levites entered into the inner court, the court of the priests, where the sacrifices to God were to be prepared and offered. Now you may notice here that as they go into each level or court of the temple, they keep rising. So when they first go into the temple, they go up steps. When they go from one court to the next court, they go up steps. When they get to the actual temple itself, they go up more steps. So there's this constant rising of steps as you go from the very outside to the very inside to where the Ark of the Covenant will be placed, where the inner chamber is. So you can sort of get that picture that as we increase, as we come closer to God in the holiness of this place, that there's actually a rising that occurs in levels as well. So climbing the steps of the Dukan, the priests and Levites entered the inner court, the court of the priests, where the sacrifices to God were to be prepared and offered. Before them, in the centre of the court, was the huge bronze brazen altar. Also called the altar of burnt offerings, it will be used to burn grain and liquid offerings as well as animals. So beside me there, that's that large picture on the far side, the huge altar that was there. Now it was almost 9 meters in length and 4.5 meters in height. It was so big that a kebesh, a bridge of planks, was needed to connect it to the ground. So once again, they had to go up a level to get to the actual top of the altar itself. To the left of the altar, closer to the temple building, was what was called a sea. Now the sea was made from cast metal. It was circular and shaped like a big bowl, almost 4.5 meters in diameter and almost 2.5 meters deep in the center. It was used by the priests for washing. So you can see that picture there of the sea with the bulls underneath it near the entrance. The sea, as I said, it sat on top of 12 bulls, and there's 3 that face in each direction of the compass: north, south, east and west. There was also 10 portable things called lavers. So these are basins, and they're on holders with wheels. So they're on the far side in the foreground there. And they're spaced around the courtyard, and they're carved with intricate figures of lions, cherubim and palm trees. They were used for washing implements that were needed for the burnt offering. So you can imagine this inner courtyard before you get to the temple. It's like a huge kitchen. They're slaughtering the animals as you come through the entrance up the Dukan steps. Then they have the altar where they're actually burning the sacrifices to God. And then for those priests who are actually washing themselves to consecrate themselves to God to do this work, there's the big bowl on top of these bulls in order for them to wash themselves. And for all the implements and things they needed to do this work, they had these portable lavers. So I hope this has given you a really good picture of what the inner courtyard of the temple was like. It was all about bringing offerings and sacrifices to the Lord. Now to their right, as I mentioned, when you came through the gate from the outer court or the women's court into the inner court, there was an abattoir. And it's an area, and it was full of rings that secured the heads of the animals so they could be killed and have their blood collected. Beyond them were 4 rows of tables where they washed the sacrifices before passing their carcasses to 4 rows of posts where they were hung, skinned, and had their entrails removed. Now you can imagine what it would be like today when we went to church if this is what we actually did. Can you imagine that we would pass through from an outer court to an inner court? The women were left behind. We go to the inner court and we would see animals being slaughtered, sacrificed, burnt, skinned, and all the things that come with that, all the cleaning and the blood, etc. It would just be an extraordinary sight. So you can see that these are practices that were put in place. These are some of the commandments that God gave to his priesthood that they would have to perform to make a sacrifice that was suitable for him. Now entering the inner court, stood there before the priests and the Levites was their king, King Solomon in his entire splendor. The entire assembly of Israel, called to come for this occasion, surrounded him. The priests would pass by the altar and set down the ark before their king. So remember, I'm describing these priests who had been carrying the Ark of the Covenant from the tent, from the city of David, and they carried it through, and I'm describing what they would have seen as they passed through. So they come before King Solomon, and they set down the ark before the king on the ground. So that day, the house of the Lord and the altar of God began to actually function. Those who had been called by their king had brought their sacrifices and offerings with them. They all gave a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah, which is 2 litres, of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin, which is 1 litre of olive oil. Now this is to be found in Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verse 4. For each lamb brought for the burnt offering or sacrifice, 1/4 of a hin, so again that's 1/4 of 1 litre, of wine was also given as a drink offering. For each ram, a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah, so that's 4.5 litres, of fine flour mixed with 1/3 hin, so that's 1 1/5 litres of olive oil, was given with 1/3 hin of wine as a drink offering. So you can see that there's all these set measures that go with these particular animals. So for a lamb, there's an offering component. For a ram, there's another offering component. And then next I'm going to give it to you for a bull. So for each young bull, a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah, so that's 6.5 litres mixed with 1/2 hin of 2 litres of oil, was given with 1/2 hin, 2 litres of wine as a drink offering. So there's all these precise measurements. This was required for the preparation of each animal. The offerings that were burnt by fire, the book of Numbers, in chapter 15, verse 10, it says that the offerings that were burnt by fire gave an aroma that was pleasing to the Lord. So the time had come, now that the sacrifices were well underway, for the priest to take the Ark of the Covenant into the temple to its resting place, so the temple could be dedicated to the Lord. The priest would have gripped the poles and raised the ark to their shoulders once again. As they straightened up, they would have looked at the immense temple before them. You can see the picture there. Its entrance was marked by two colossal pillars decorated with ornate capitals, so they're the pieces on the top. They carried the ark up the 12 stairs to its entrance, once again going up in elevation, and passed through the portico. The temple was built from dressed blocks of limestone, but when they entered the holy place, the main hall of the temple building, there was none to be seen. The inside was pure gold. The ceiling beams, door frames, walls and doors, they had all been overlaid with gold. Figures of gourds and open flowers had been carved into the wall cedar cladding before they were overlaid with gold. And although the floors were made from planks of pine, they too had been overlaid with gold. So you could just imagine how incredible this place must have been. So the glory of the hall was breathtaking, beyond compared. Nothing on the earth was like this. As they walked forward, there were 5 tables sat along the walls on either side, upon which were gold wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, dishes, and censers. Directly ahead of them was a golden altar to burn incense, and on the right a golden table was there to hold 12 unleavened loaves of lechem hapanim, bread of the face of God, otherwise known as the bread of presence. The bread was to be put there every Sabbath, and the priests were to eat it by the end of the week. On the left was the golden lampstand, the menorah, which had 3 branches extending from each side to form 7 branches. So there's the one in the centre and 3 from either side. Each looked like the branch of an almond tree containing buds, blossoms and flowers that held lamps of olive oil with wicks to burn continuously. Beyond the golden altar was a wall from which a veil or a curtain hung, made of blue, purple and crimson yarn and fine linen. It had figures of cherubim woven into it. They headed to the centre with the Ark of the Covenant on the poles on their shoulders. They headed to the centre where there was a pair of doors made of olive wood that led to the inner sanctuary. The doors took up 1/5 of the wall. They had been carved with figures of cherubim, palm trees and open flowers, and were also overlaid with gold. On either side of the door stood 5 lampstands made from pure gold. Even the door hinges were made from pure gold. The priests traversed this main hall to climb the last set of stairs to enter the inner sanctuary, the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, known as Kodesh Kodashim. There were no windows to illuminate this room of gold, but there was 2 huge sculptured cherubim clad in gold whose wingspan covered almost 9 meters. And I haven't mentioned, but a cherubim is an angel. Stood on their feet facing the main hall on opposite sides of the room, one wing of each cherubim arced to the other side until it touched the wing of the other. The other wing reached forward and touched the back of the temple wall that separated the Holy of Holies from the main hall. So you can imagine you've got the 2 bodies of the angels in the corners, one long wing pointing to each other along the back wall, and 2 wings pointing towards the front of the wall which they'd passed through where the door was. It was here that the Ark of the Covenant, with the 2 stone tablets inside, the flask of manna, and the budded rod of Aaron, was put down to rest beneath the wings of the cherubim. The references for these can be found in the first book of Kings, chapter 8, verse 9, the second book of Chronicles, chapter 5, verse 10, and it can also be found in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament in chapter 9, verse 4. The priests then withdrew themselves from the holy place. First, they closed the doors and fastened the golden chains that extended across the front of the sanctuary. They then came down the steps and drew the colossal woven veil across the wall. It reached the ceiling and went from one side of the room to the other. Outside, the Levite musicians stood between the altar and the Nicanor gate, dressed in fine linen, and they played cymbals, harps, and lyres. And in the second book of Chronicles, in chapter 5, verses 12 to 13, it reads, "They were accompanied by 120 priests sounding trumpets. The trumpeters and singers joined in unison as with one voice to give praise and thanks to the Lord. Accompanied by trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments, they raised their voices in praise to the Lord and sang, 'He is good, His love endures forever.'" What an incredible sight that must have been. King Solomon then said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." The king had been facing the temple. He had watched as the Ark of the Covenant had been carried up the steps and taken inside. But now that the priests had returned and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, he turned around to face the whole assembly of Israel, and he blessed them. Now he was stood on a bronze platform in the center of the courtyard. King Solomon praised the Lord and recounted how he had been chosen to build the temple. He then knelt down and spread his hand toward heaven and prayed. And in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 6, verse 14, it says, "O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven or on earth." The king's prayer was long. He questioned whether God would really dwell on earth with men when the heavens could not contain him. He asked the Lord to hear his people's prayers from heaven when they were in need and forgive their sins when they repented with all their heart and soul. He finished saying, "Now, my God, may your eyes be open and your ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. Now arise, O Lord God, and come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. May your priests, O Lord God, be clothed with salvation. May your saints rejoice in your goodness. O Lord God, do not reject your anointed one. Remember the great love promised to David, your servant." This is read from the second book of Chronicles, chapter 6, verses 40 to 42. When King Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. The glory of the Lord filled the temple. In 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 2 to 3, it says, "The priests could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. When all the Israelites saw the fire coming down and the glory of the Lord above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, 'He is good, His love endures forever.'" The king and his people continued to offer sacrifices before the Lord and dedicated the temple of God. There were so many offerings that they could not be fulfilled on the huge bronze altar. So King Solomon consecrated the middle part of the courtyard in front of the temple to have more space. King Solomon personally provided 22,000 head of cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. The priests, who normally were meticulously recording all that they did, they neither bothered to count nor record how many cattle, sheep, and goats they slaughtered. The king observed the festival for 7 days, until on the 8th day he again held an assembly. The celebration was over. The altar and the temple had been dedicated, and it was time to go home. In the second book of Chronicles, chapter 7, verse 10, it reads, "On the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people to their homes, joyful and glad in heart for the good things the Lord had done for David and Solomon and for his people Israel." So you can see here this extraordinary event that happened for the opening of the temple, the incredible numbers of animals that were slaughtered as sacrifices to God. So this whole population was obliged to bring an animal to be sacrificed. King Solomon also, for this feast, laid on this incredible number of animals, and they stopped counting because of the sheer quantity. Now, for the next 6 years, King Solomon finished his own palace and he built one for his wife, who was Egyptian. And when he when he finished them in 954 BC, his wife moved up from the city of David and took residence in a new palace. King Solomon had been ruling Israel for 17 years by this stage, and he'd now reached the age of 57. It was at this time the Lord appeared to him one night and said, "I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices." He also said, and both of these are in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 7. He also said, "Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever." Forever. "My eyes and my heart will always be there." But the Lord also warned the king that if his people sin, they will need to humble themselves, seek him and pray, and turn from their wicked ways. And if they do, he'll hear them from heaven and forgive them. But if King Solomon or his sons don't obediently observe his laws and decrees, or choose to go off to serve and worship other gods, then he said he will remove Israel from his land and reject the temple consecrated to his name. So I hope this gives you an incredible insight into the temple, not just to the practices of the temple, the physical practices, but also to its purpose. It was a place of sacrifice, and you could see that the prayers of the people were also brought here, because the Lord said that he would be attentive, his ears would be attentive to the prayers that were offered in this place, that he had chosen and consecrated this temple so that his name may be there forever. So there's that forever word. He said, "My eyes and my heart will always be there." So even to this very day, this is part of forever. It is his place. It is God's chosen city. And so this is a very powerful thing, isn't it? So we bring ourselves to this point now where King Solomon had built this temple, and then history continued. But unfortunately, King Solomon fell from grace. He started to marry many women, and he started to build altars and high places to foreign gods, and children began to be sacrificed to these false gods. And he fell from grace. So his son, King Rehoboam, found himself in a situation where almost as soon as he began his tenure as king, that the kingdom was torn into two, and the northern kingdom of Israel was formed under a king, Jeroboam I, and the southern part of the kingdom became the kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom went on to place golden calves at the northern and southern boundaries, at Dan to the north and at Bethel to the south. And they stopped the people from going to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, to bring their sacrifices to the temple. So he basically shut down the nation. 10 out of the 12 tribes were separated from God at that point in time. And the consequence of that was that the Assyrians were sent to remove those people. The kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, carried on for many more years than that. And they had good kings and bad kings. But eventually they succumbed to the same evil. And they were removed by King Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian king. And they were taken off into this land. So the temple was destroyed. So this was a second time now that we have this situation where the people, God's chosen people, were taken off into a foreign land. First they went off to Egypt, and now they've gone off to Babylon. They've been taken and put into bondage, put into slavery because of their disobedience to their Heavenly Father. It is at this point in time when the kingdom of Judah ceases to exist. There is no more kingdom. Now later on, King Cyrus the Great comes along, and the Lord uses him to send his people back to the holy city. However, they're not free anymore, because they come under the empire. They're under the Persian Empire. They're no longer free people. However, because they were returned back to what was the former kingdom of Judah, these people were actually known as the people of Judah, because this is where they had come from. And this is what the word Jews means. So we have this situation where at the time of Abraham, he was known as a Hebrew, meaning from the other side of the Euphrates River. He was a foreigner who spoke a different language and probably looked different. When Jacob had his name changed to Israel, the people became Israelites whilst they were in captivity in Egypt. And now that they'd gone into captivity and returned from Babylon, they were now known as Jews. But the name represents events in history that changed how people perceived God's chosen people. So as we know them today, we know the people as Jewish people. So these are the descendants of those people that have been taken away and enslaved in Babylon. So from here we move on forwards to the time of Jesus. And when we get to the time of Jesus, we have a few steps between the Persian Empire and when he came and was born under the Roman Empire. So in between there, we had the Greek Empire that actually came and took over from the Persian Empire. And there was a situation that occurred there when they started to bring in all of their foreign gods into the actual temple. So we're going to next have a look at what happened during that period of time. Well, here we enter into a new period, a period of time in which people are usually less familiar with what actually occurred in relation to the Jewish people. This is a time where you can actually follow what happens by understanding the book of Daniel, because Daniel prophesied into this period of time where the temple would be desecrated, and this was called the abomination of desolation. And this is when this Greek god, this statue of Zeus Olympus, was placed in the temple of Jerusalem itself. Now, these things occurred during the time of a king by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and he was the leader of what was known as the Seleucid Empire. So after Alexander the Great came and swept through the region and overpowered the Persian Empire, his life was only to be short. He died in his early 30s. And the consequence of that was that his empire fractured because he didn't have a descendant to inherit the throne. His generals ended up separating the kingdom into pieces and taking a piece each. This, of course, led to endless conflict as they jousted for power. The former kingdom of Judah, which was now a province of Judah, or Judea, as it was name was changed to under the Persian Empire, was now a subject of a conflict which occurred to their north and to their south. So to the north is Syria, and the Seleucid Empire controlled that region of Syria amongst many other regions. To their south was the Egyptian Empire, and that was controlled by the Ptolemies, so another Greek general. So these two powers were basically jousting backwards and forward, and the Jewish people were caught in the middle of this throughout an extensive period of time. So they would go through a period of time when they were ruled by one power, and then they would be sacked, and then they'd be ruled by another power. When I mean sacked, I don't mean that the government was sacked. I mean that the Judean people would be caught between the middle of a war between two warring nations. So there was usually consequences for them. Now, mature men were actually drafted into the different armies, so they would actually enter into this conflict, and then those people who remained at home would obviously try and remain outside of this conflict. And there was prophetic words that were given by Daniel, which actually helped the people. So when they had a new power coming in to take over the city, they wouldn't enter into conflict and flight. In fact, they would open their gates and embrace them. And Daniel warned them of this. And fortunately, they embraced this word, and they were able to come through this situation fairly well until this time of this ruler that I have the bust of next to me here, Antiochus. So over on the far side, you can see Zeus there. So there's an artist's impression of the Zeus Olympus sitting in the temple. You'll see in his right hand, he's holding a figurine, and that's below me there. And that figurine is another goddess called Nike. So you may wear Nike shoes today and think, oh, it's a great brand, blah, blah, blah. But it has its origins by name of a false Greek goddess. So here we are at this point in time where this jousting has happened, and this Antiochus, he had been down to Egypt, and he found that he was frustrated because the Roman Empire by this time was on the rise. So they were actually signing treaties with the Romans in order that there was no conflict on those boundaries. And the Romans were basically protecting Egypt because they used to receive most of their goods for producing food from them. So they would buy large volumes of wheat, for example. So they would protect their interests because they needed to feed their expanding empire, feed their armies, and feed their people. So as a consequence of this, the Romans weighed into the situation. So you can see this point in history is getting very complicated. So the Judeans found themselves mixed in the middle of this very tumultuous situation. So at this point in time, this particular king came along. He went to go down south and found that he couldn't do what he wanted to do. So he was frustrated, and he came back to Jerusalem. And there'd been some jousting between the priests at the time. There was two priests who were actually vying for power as the high priest. And as a consequence of that, they actually believed that when King Antiochus IV had gone down to Egypt, they'd heard a rumor that he'd actually been killed. So they basically went to take over, thinking, well, here's our opportunity. And of course, he wasn't killed, so he came back and he was furious. So when he came back, he actually killed 40,000 people, and another 80,000 people were either injured or they were actually sold into slavery. So there was this huge consequence for this situation. Now, the people in the society, because they've been under what they call Hellenization, underneath a form of Greek rule of one kind or another, since the time of Alexander the Great. So the Greeks had actually built an acra, which is a name for a fortress. So they used to garrison their own soldiers there in Jerusalem. And because of this, the people who formerly used to go to the temple, the majority of them were in uproar. But then there were some of them who sort of sought favour from the Greeks because they thought it was better, and they wanted to align themselves with the Greeks. So society became very divided at this particular point in time. And of course, the consequence of that is that they either walked with the God of Israel or they actually walked with the Greeks. So a form of syncretization started to occur at this point in time, where they started to blend their walk with the Lord with this walk with the false gods of the Greeks. So at this particular point in time, there was a high priest in a place called Modin, which is just slightly to the west of Jerusalem. And this is the story of the Maccabees. And basically, he was asked to make a sacrifice to the false god in the temple, Zeus. Now, the sacrifice was actually a pig, because that's what used to get sacrificed to the Greek gods. And of course, he refused to do this. This was against his belief. It was against what God had told him to do, so he refused to do it. And this started a civil war. And this is when everything began to change, because not only were the empires from the north and the south contesting each other, and the Romans were having their say in that matter, But now there was a civil war within this particular province as well. So things were getting really heated and they were getting really complicated. So the Maccabees basically led a group of men, and they started to grow in numbers. And they would align themselves with a variety of people who were actually trying to usurp the power of the other rulers. So it was really quite a melting pot. But as the generations passed through, what happened is that the leaders became more powerful, if you will, until the Maccabees actually succeeded in taking autonomous rule within Judea again. So here they were. The prophecy said that there would no longer, after the time of the kings, when Babylonian exile came, that there would no longer be a kingdom. But here they were thinking, well, we're going to be a kingdom again. We're going to rule our own nation. So there was a period of time, and it was very short, where they actually took control of the country, and they fought and they gradually expanded their territory, aiming once again to control the territory that King David had controlled, basically the covenant land that the Lord had given to the Israelite people. So as a consequence of this, when the actual leaders of those people rose, initially they aligned themselves with these Greek rulers, and they were the wealthy people. They were the elite of the society, but obviously the majority of people were poor. So we ended up with these factions separating in the people. So the actual priests also formed factions, and there was more than two, but the two main ones which we read about in the Bible when we come to the New Testament are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So if you ask, well, what's the difference between the two? Well, the Pharisees basically aligned themselves with the poor people. So they were actually aligned to the majority of people. The Sadducees, on the other hand, aligned themselves to the elite and the rulers and the wealthy people. So they basically held the power because of their wealth and alignment, but they didn't hold the hand or the voice of the majority of the actual people. Now, the other thing that came into play at this particular point in time is that there's actually a difference in their belief system as well. So with the Pharisees, they actually believed in the oral Torah. So this was the Torah that was written down from all the additional writings during the time of Babylonian exile. So when they were there, they realized that there was a good chance that they were going to lose all of that knowledge associated around the Bible. So instead of handing it down as an oral tradition from generation to generation, they decided to put that into writing, and that became what's known as the Babylonian Talmud, which is still used to this very day. Now, the Sadducees, on the other hand, didn't believe or agree with the use of the oral Torah. So they actually would only follow the written Torah. So this was another thing that separated those two bodies of people. So when you're reading the New Testament and you wonder, well, what's the difference between these Pharisees and Sadducees? Hopefully this gives you a bit of a better understanding of the differences between these two sects or two diverging bodies of Jewish priests. Now, the Sanhedrin, which is their court, which we read about in the New Testament as well, it's either called the Council or the Sanhedrin. It was actually a body of priests who were there to enforce God's laws. So in the same situation, we ended up with a fluctuation happen where, because of the alignment with the wealthy, most of the Sanhedrin during the early part of this rebellion were actually in fact all Sadducees and had very little representation by the Pharisees. But what happened is, over a period of time, there was a change, there was a shift in power. And so what happened was there was a shift in alignment. And suddenly, where the Sadducees had been in favour, they had actually fallen out of favour, and now the Pharisees were aligned with the rulers at a later date. So the Pharisees were then in control of the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees were aligned with the rulers of the people, and the use of the oral Torah became part of the norm of their society. Now, the other consequence of this period of history is that because of this false god, Zeus in the temple, and again, as I said, you can see he's holding Nike there, but they had a whole pantheon of other gods, but these were the main characters that were placed in the temple, particularly Zeus. People were no longer going to the temple. There was no purpose. It was desecrated. How could they go there to worship this false Greek god, this idol that had been placed in the temple? So it became an issue for them: is where were they going to read the Torah? Where were they going to teach their people? Where were they going to make their sacrifices? So all of the traditions, the laws, the ordinances, the statutes, there was going to be a shift at this point in time. They had to practice their faith, but they would no longer make this about the temple. Now, the temple, they normally used to go there. Everybody went there once a year. So they would make their annual sacrifice. But even this stopped. So what happened is they formed gathering places. And these gathering places are what we know as a synagogue, what we call a synagogue. So that's the same name to this very day. And why is that? Because the temple obviously was destroyed. So they can't actually sacrifice at the temple. So the synagogue was formed as a gathering place in all of the communities. Now, when we think about these, the Temple of Jerusalem was a massive structure. So the synagogues, however, were very different. They were basically small structures which were built amongst the communities, the villages and the towns throughout the land. Now, when I went to Israel, we saw a replica, one that had been built in Nazareth, to show what the synagogue would have been like that Jesus visited. And it would be, at an absolute maximum, be able to hold 40 to 50 people. So if you consider that this was all of the members of the local society, you can see that the communities were actually very small in size. Now, if you go to Capernaum, to the synagogue there at the north of the Sea of Galilee, now we know that Jesus preached there and that this was Peter's hometown. Now the synagogue there is considerably bigger, but it was built by King Herod and it was built over the top of the original synagogue. So Jesus went there and Jesus also taught there as well. But even that synagogue at full capacity would only be able to hold a couple of hundred people. So I'm going to put up a couple of pictures following this message that I'm speaking now, and you can have a look at a couple of those pictures of what the synagogue was actually like, so you can get an idea. But the point is that the synagogue became a gathering place. So it became the place where they read the Torah. It became the place where they gathered together for prayer. It's where they taught their children. It's where their whole community came together. So at this point in time, church was synagogue. It wasn't the temple anymore during this particular period of time. So this gives you some insight into where the Pharisees came from, where the Sadducees came from, the difference between the practice of the Sadducees who didn't follow the oral Torah and the Pharisees who did follow the oral Torah. And it also is the birth of the synagogue in the land of Israel. So it's a particularly important period of time because a lot of the things that we know today are actually birthed out of this season, this very difficult season in their history. So I'm going to put up those pictures for you of these synagogues, and then we're going to move forward into the time of when Jesus came and what happened with the temple and the synagogues at that period of time. Here we are in this replica of an ancient synagogue. When we were up in Tel Hazor, we talked about the pillars and the raised roof section. So here we are in this replica, and you can actually see how that roof is raised, how these pillars are here, and then the seats that are sitting around. So in the time of Jesus, this is the gathering place, as it says. The word synagogue, both in Greek and Hebrew, it means place of gathering. So you can see these steps that they sit on all the way around the sides here. So they will be sitting around there on the table there with a scroll. That's where Jesus would have got up and spoke in the synagogue. And you can see this sort of comes around here and back out to the entrance. There's modern day Nazareth in the background. But this is just an incredible experience to be in this building, to see how it actually lays out, and to place ourselves back in time and imagine all the people sitting around the side reading their scripture. They came here to read the Bible, as it tells us in the scriptures, and this is exactly the environment or the setting that Jesus would have stood in and read from the book of Isaiah. This is just magnificent. So just sort of panning all around so you can sort of get a bit of a feel for what the building was like. There with the thatched roof, the light coming through the windows at the top there, the pillars that support the inner roof to increase the size of the chamber, and also to let the light on the top, and of course the stairs around the side so people can sit down. So this is it. This is what the early synagogue started to look like. So this is what was built in the time of the Greeks when they put the false god Zeus into the temple. So they started forming synagogues, and they would go together and read, and no longer go to the temple of Jerusalem.
Well, fast forwarding to the time of Jesus, the rule of the Maccabees didn't last for very long. In fact, it only lasted for 126 years, and the Roman Empire did come in and take over the whole of the Levant, which is the eastern side of the Mediterranean. So they in fact grew to be a massive empire, and all of those warring parties that had existed during the time of the various Greek rulers had now ceased to exist because the Romans had taken over all the different territory. So at this point in time, the Romans came in. There was a lot of syncretization still around, so the Romans actually accepted the Greek gods. So it was quite common with these ancient powers that the gods that they saw that were powerful, they would adopt into their own pantheon, or they'd syncretize and join them together with gods of their own. And so the Romans did this. So during the time of Jesus, there were still people in this land who were there very much worshipping false gods. However, by this point in time, because of the Maccabees, the Zeus statue that had been in the Temple of Jerusalem had been removed, and they had reinstituted the yearly sacrifice, etc., and running the priesthood from the Temple of Jerusalem. So at this point in time, Romans are ruling. Jesus has been born and living in the land, and we find that this temple had been returned to being run by the high priest and the Sanhedrin, and people were going to and fro the temple to make their annual sacrifices, go there for prayer, etc., etc. So when Jesus was born during Roman rule, King Herod was ruling at the time. The Bible tells us that King Herod died when Jesus was a little boy. It was somewhere between when he was 4 and 6 years old. Jesus had been taken off to Egypt for his protection because King Herod sought to kill him, recognizing that he had been born as a king, not understanding what that actually meant. So when Jesus came back, it was normal for his family once a year to come down to the temple and to make their annual sacrifices. So we have the story of Jesus when he remains behind because he's there talking to the priests. So he's being taught and he's learning. His parents left. Today we might think that's a bit of a surprise, like how could they leave and not notice that their own son's missing. But in those days, they used to all go there as an annual sacrifice. So their whole town, their whole village would go together. So I imagine it would have been quite common that they would have actually taken care of each other's children, because they would bring up their children as a village, so as a group of people. So they of course went back and found him there, and he was safe and well. So this was a place where Jesus grew up. This was part of his teaching and his grounding in his childhood. Also at the temple, this is the place where Jesus was presented when he was 8 days old. So he was washed in the mikvah bath, he was consecrated by water, and he was taken and presented to the Lord at the temple as well. So this was part of everyday life for the Jewish people. But in the mix here, we have a local ruler. So King Herod gave way to another King Herod, but obviously he was the next generation. So Jesus' life was influenced by the issues with the Romans having power there, and yet it was complicated because we had King Herod as a local ruler, and yet we still had the Sanhedrin being run by the priesthood, who were actually there to govern their own people. So from the Roman point of view, as long as people behaved and paid their taxes, they didn't really care. So they would rather the local authority would police their own people, would enforce their own laws, etc., and they could pretty much stay out of that. But when Jesus came along, he was perceived as a threat to the Sanhedrin when he became a mature man after he was baptized, and he started to walk through the land performing miracles and wonders. And obviously he was defined as the King of the Jews, and so he was put across as this threat, that he was a threat to the Roman Empire. And of course the final consequence, without going through the whole story, was that he was crucified. And of course after 3 days he rose again and showed in fact that he was whom he had said he was, as the Son of God. So at this point in time, Jesus remained until the day of Pentecost. He went up to be with his Father, and at that point in time the Holy Spirit was released upon his people, and we had the beginning of the Christian church in essence. Now during this time, when Jesus was walking the land during his ministry, this is a significant moment. So this ministry that I'm running is called the Jesus Movement. It's actually named during this time because the Essenes, who were in Qumran as we know it today, where they were transcribing the Dead Sea Scrolls, those men, they went there, they left their families, they left their wives, and they went there because they saw it as a corrupt society and they weren't following the laws of God accordingly, etc. So they moved away to have a pure faith and to do the Lord's work. So they'd heard about Jesus, but they hadn't met him. So because Jesus was moving through the land and performing miracles and wonders, they actually called it the Jesus Movement. And this is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is where I've actually taken the name for this particular ministry that I'm running, called the Jesus Movement. So it's cased in fact, and it's also very important because it's an extra biblical reference to the fact that Jesus was a real man, that he walked this earth, because it is actually recorded in extra biblical writing. So for me, I find that extraordinary, and I find it something that's very confirming for my faith. Now, after Jesus left, we have all of the issues with the formation of the church at the time, because we had the disciples who were Jewish men, and they were going out, and predominantly they were used to teaching Jewish people. But of course this was challenged at the time because of all the Gentiles, so meaning the non-Jewish people. So Peter went across to Jaffa and up to Caesarea, and he went there because he was called there when he was traveling the land, because a lady by the name of Tabitha, who was a disciple of Jesus, had died, and he went across there and prayed for her, and she rose from the dead. He stayed there at Simon the Tanner's house in Jaffa, and then he was actually called up to Caesarea further up the coast, which is ancient door, and he was called there by the centurion Cornelius. And he went up there and he found himself, after having a vision, realizing that it wasn't just a faith for the Jewish people anymore, it was actually for all people. So he found himself eating and dining and teaching Gentile people, which is something that they would never have done. He said in the Bible that it's against the law for him to actually do that. So we have this confronting period of time. Then, of course, we have the Apostle Paul, who's traveling all over the land. He's gone up into all of the area of Turkey and Greece and Italy, etc., as we know it today. And he's putting churches on the ground everywhere, but he's doing that with Gentile people. So this was a challenging time for the church because they didn't know how to do it, because they were all Jewish people who were actually going out and trying to work out what it actually looked like, because they still practiced their faith as Jewish people, and yet they were speaking of Christ at this point in time. So it wasn't until much later in Antioch, in 325 AD, and the Bible mentions this, that Christians as a name was coined, and it was actually used as a derogatory name to identify people who were followers of Christ. Now, in 66 AD, the Jewish people revolted against the Romans. They thought that they would be able to oust the Romans. And so they revolted and they fought against them. But by the time we arrived at 70 AD, 4 years later, the temple was destroyed and burnt to the ground by the Romans. So this fulfilled the prophecy that Jesus said that the temple would be razed to the ground. Now these people, the last of the Jewish people, went to Masada, and at Masada they put up a last stand against the Romans, and the Romans built a ramp up to this incredible fortress and went to take over them, only to find that the Jewish people had decided to actually kill each other in order to not let themselves become slaves to the Romans once again. At this point in time, the rest of the Jewish people, they had fled the land and they became the diaspora, so they actually travelled into the rest of the world, and then history unfolds from that point of view. Now, for the purposes of this lesson, that's not where we're actually heading, but we're actually heading on the basis of this history, this following, this tracking, this understanding of how we went from the tent of meeting at the time of Moses to the building of the temple of Jerusalem during the time of King Solomon. When they were taken into Babylonian exile and they came back, they rebuilt the temple during the Persian reign, and of course they come all the way through the Greek rule, the problems with the Zeus being put into the temple, so hence the formation of the synagogues, and then we arrive at this time, the temple's razed to the ground. So the Jewish people are continuing with their synagogues in their society, whilst the followers of Jesus are now planting what we would call home churches, to build the church that follows Jesus. So we have this difference, this separation that's happening now between Christian and Jewish people. So what does that look like today? We have this situation where when we travel all the way through, this formation of the church is no longer about the building. So these massive temple that was built, it was destroyed. So it's not there anymore. The synagogues were used as a place of gathering for the Jewish people. So it was no longer the place where they did sacrifices. So, and that remains the same to this day. So there was a change at that particular point in time. But for people who are followers of Jesus, and we call this the church, meaning the community of God, it's developed from going from home churches again into buildings, places that people come, that we call it the gathering of the saints, to come together to worship and praise the Lord, and it's a place where we teach and gather together. Now, this is where we get into some complications, because we enter into a time where ministry has multiple aspects to ministry. The two that I want to focus on is the difference between teaching and preaching. We talk about missions work. We talk about the ability to prophesy, for example. So there's other areas, obviously, in ministry, but I want to talk about these two particular areas, because how do we do that? How do we define the difference between teaching and preaching? So again, if we come back to this time when Paul was out and about, and the other disciples, what they were doing were they were going out and they were proclaiming the gospel. So they were saying it for the first time to non-believers. So this is what we mean by proclaiming. We're telling them something they haven't heard before. But when we come to teaching, that's the reserve of those who have already come to believe, and we're now actually teaching them, giving them insight and understanding, teaching the Bible, teaching the Torah as they would have in those days. And we see this significant difference. But in the modern church, one of the things that happens is that we have a combination of people. We have people who are perhaps been Christians for many, many years of their lives. But then we also have those who are new, who are coming in. So we have this situation where we have to cater, I guess, for both. We need to disciple and equip people, but we're also bringing people who need to hear the message being proclaimed for the first time, people who are going to give their life to the Lord. So we have that whole pathway where people come into the church, where they're discipled, they give their life to the Lord, they're then equipped, and then, of course, they should then become an apostle. This is where people set out to actually disciple others. So the word disciple comes from disciples. It's a Greek word, and the word disciples means to follow. So when we're disciples, we're followers of Jesus. But once we get to the point where we go out, we become what we call apostles. That comes from the Greek word apostolos, and that means to set forth. So part of our journey as Christians is that we get discipled, and then we actually disciple others and we become apostles. So that should be part of our life's journey. We should all be growing, we should all be changing, and it's an ongoing part of our life. But part of what we're called to do by Jesus is to go out to the four corners of the earth and share the gospel. And that means that we're going to proclaim the word, and then we're also going to disciple, which means we're going to teach the word. So again, we have those two areas that come together. So this brings me to this erroneous comment I made in the title of this video, where I said, is my church a temple, a synagogue, or an onion? So we've taken you through this journey, and you can see that in our modern era, that the practices that were originally put into place at the tent meeting and the temple, some of those are just no longer possible, because the Temple Mount to this day doesn't exist. The temple doesn't exist, only the Temple Mount. So the third temple has never been rebuilt, as Jesus said. So that means that at church today, it's not about the building, it's not about where we go. Churches come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, from grand cathedrals right down to little timber structures in the country that hold a handful of people. In modern times, they often end up in factory zones, or theatres. And some people will say, well, that's not right, but it's not about the building, because the church is within us. So God said that our body is the temple. So Jesus lives in our heart. The Holy Spirit is with us. So it's not about where we gather. It's not about the physical building anymore. But we do gather as saints. So we come together in churches. For most people, it's on a Sunday. For some people, it's on a Saturday. Putting that issue aside, the point is that we come together and we gather as saints. But what happens in that situation, depending on the size of the church, depending on the society and the culture, we find that there's all these variations. There's incredible number of denominations around the world. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this causes separation between churches, because they have different doctrines and different dogmas. And we even have this situation where it's said that if you don't believe what I believe or practice the way that I practice, then you couldn't be a Christian. For me, I only like to follow one thing, and it's actually called the Bible. Now, the Holy Bible tells us everything that we need to know, and this is what we need to practice. So when we look at churches, and I talk about the onion, some of the layers of the onion are affected by the fact that an onion is a ball of concentric circles. So they're all one wrapped around another, and yet they've got separate layers. So the church is like that. We've got different denominations, but we're all bound together by Christianity. On a more micro scale, when we go into church, what does that actually look like? So we come in, and if we enter the church, we could call that the outside ring. So when we come into the church, our first impression is what we see. Perhaps it's the building, it's the people who greet us. Do we like the worship? Was the music nice? Was the drums too loud? Was the lights annoying? I liked the preacher, I didn't like the preacher. I liked the people, I didn't like the people. This is often what happens when we enter church. So we're not actually focused on the Lord, we're actually focused on everything else but. So once we arrive at church and we join that community, the layers of the onion that I talk about in that instance is we could place the senior pastor as that very center piece within the actual onion. So how does the new person, especially in big churches, the new person that enters the door ever get to interact with the senior pastor? Sometimes it never happens. And for me, that's a very sad thing, because it's meant to be a community. So we're meant to actually be people that come together. As a consequence of that, many churches have secondary layers, if you will, like the onion. So we have things like connect groups, we have life groups, we have social groups, we have Bible study groups, we have ladies groups, we have men's groups, we have children's groups, we have youth groups. These are all different layers in that onion, and they're all put into place to form community and form relationship between like groups of people in order that they enter into an interpersonal relationship at church. So the challenge in the modern day church is when somebody comes into that outside layer, that they must have a pathway through all of those layers. And the senior pastors, I encourage that they must make themselves available to all people in their congregation. It's only natural and only right that they are available to people. I know that's a challenge, because in a big congregation, how do you see everybody? But people work that out. They take that moment of time to engage directly with new people. So in today's modern church, we're no longer doing sacrifices. We no longer got an annual place that we go to, like the temple, for example. I think the modern church is much more like the synagogue model, because it's a place where we gather together, we come to read the scripture together, and we come to do life together. Often that's broken down, as I said, into smaller groups to enable that, but that is the way that the modern church is. So as an onion, I would like to think that those layers aren't allowed to remain separate. We have layers, but they must be integrated. There must be a way of moving from one layer to another layer. So for all of us who run churches, all of us who participate in churches, we must not look at our churches as layers where we don't have certain amount of contact, but that we have layers in place that allow people to pass from one to another, so there's a pathway there. So I pray that you've enjoyed this lesson. I hope you've learnt a lot about what the institution of church looks like, right back from the time of Moses, when God first put the priesthood into place. So that's still relevant for us today. We have a responsibility and an accountability as pastors, reverends, priests, whatever the denomination's title may be. But basically, we're ministers of the gospel. So we have an accountability to share the gospel, to disciple people, to equip people, and to help people on their journey through life. And obviously to then set them free in order that they too can do this for others. So I pray that this lesson's been a blessing. It's been a lot of fun to teach on this area. I hope I've brought some life and some light to one of these topic areas which is not so often looked at, but is very important. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure to have your company. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. So just beneath me there is the address. It's the Jesus Movement Paul Brunton. If you type that into the search bar and bring that up, and if you press the red subscribe button, that will allow you to see all of the videos on my channel. If you press the bell notification symbol there as well, it will actually send you notifications to your email each time a new video is released for your convenience. I've also have a website, thejesusmovement.com.au, which is listed there. Its purpose is to also provide a place for you to watch the videos, but it also is a place where you can book tours to Israel. You can read the blogs which I'm writing there, which are interest articles about Israel as well. And also there is a resources section on there. So we're building a range of teaching resources. So they're in the form of ebooks and hard copy manuals, which you can order from the website. So avail yourself of those. Again, if you can subscribe. One of the reasons for that is it increases our platform on YouTube. It means that more people will see this teaching. The purpose of this ministry is to teach. It is to share the gospel. It is to teach about the land of Israel. So every time you press that subscribe button, we increase our reach around the world, and we make sure that the word of the Lord has the very presence that it should enjoy. So thank you so much. God bless you, and I look forward to you joining me another time.